Hi, I'm Zazie Todd, and you're tuned in to the Backyard Pet Talk with Shannon Riley podcast.
Zazie, I am so excited to have you as a guest again. People probably have heard our podcast before from WAG and Purr, and I just enjoy having you as a guest here. But now we have something all new. Your brand new book will be coming out in October Bark, The Science of Helping Anxious, Fearful, or Reactive Dogs. I wanted to make sure I got that title correct, but I love it because that is my primary, that's what I do privately training is reactive, fearful, anxious dogs. So I'm always happy when you can start having more information about this and the science behind it, and then the positive training and your writing is so wonderful. So it's so fun to have you here and excited about this upcoming book. Before we start diving into the book, can you tell anybody, maybe we have some listeners who have, they're new to your writing or new to your information. Can you tell us just a little bit about who you are and your background, just in case our listeners don't know much about you yet?
Sure, and thank you for that lovely introduction. It's such a pleasure to chat with you again. I was so excited about this recording. And yeah, so I'm Zazie, and my background is originally in psychology. I have a PhD in human psychology, and a while back, I got suddenly very interested in canine science and feline science when I had two dogs, and I kept noticing that the kinds of information I saw on TV or read about often did not match with my what I knew from being a psychologist beforehand. So I started writing companion animal psychology blog in 2012. And I'm still writing it. It's a place where you can go to learn more about science and our pets. And I'm also the author of WAG, The Science of Making Your Dog Happy, and Purr, The Science of Making Your Cat Happy.
I'm super excited to have you. And I think it's just so fascinating. And what we are realizing is so much of the human psychology is so closely related to animal psychology, too. So we can make that leap from the human world to the animal world. And so I'm so happy that you're in our field and part of this community. So now for the new exciting thing that you have are about ready to launch, tell us about Bark and how you were inspired about it, what it's about. Just tell us a little bit about Bark.
Yeah, so it's Bark, The Science of Helping Your Anxious, Fearful, or Reactive Dog. And I wrote it because there are so many people with dogs that are fearful or anxious. And I think it's really important for them to be able to get good advice on what to do. And I wanted to make it easier for them to understand how to apply the science because there's a huge science behind what we do as you know when we're working with people on dog training and dog behavior, and it's very relevant to our everyday lives, but it doesn't necessarily filter through, or it doesn't necessarily filter through in a timely manner for people to hear about it and act on it. So I wanted to write something that would be evidence-based on the science, but also very, very practical and full of tips for people to use. And it's got a first part, which is really about the main things that anyone with an anxious or reactive dog needs to know about. And it's got a set of chapters specific to particular issues. So whether that's resource guarding or social fears like fears of other people and other dogs, or some of the more tricky things of when you should see a vet as well, for compulsive disorders, for example. And then it's got a final section that pulls it all together so to help people really know what they can do to help their dog.
That exactly. And one thing, you talk about the percentage of how many dogs. I know I've been doing this for almost 30 years. And I have seen an uptick of anxious dogs or people just actually noticing their dogs are anxious. Sometimes they were anxious before, but just nobody, they just kind of dealt with it. And the dog just had to suffer in a lot of ways. In your book, you talk about like how it might have been your blog. Now I'm not sure which one I read, about what percentage are they thinking there of anxiety is within dogs?
Yeah, and it's actually huge. So there's one study that found that almost three-quarters of dogs have some kind of fear or anxiety. And that's a huge number. And of course, part of the issue is that people don't necessarily recognize. So, in some of the research, for example, when people are asked if their dog is afraid of fireworks, maybe you get about a quarter of them will say yes. But when you ask more detailed questions like, does your dog tremble or shake when there are fireworks? Do they run and hide when there are fireworks? It seems that actually it's more like 50%. And in some studies, it might even be higher for the number of dogs being afraid of loud noises. That's one of the most common fears. Um, so it's really important for people to be able to recognize the signs that their dog is fearful, because until they do that, they can't do anything about it. And then you mentioned whether there's an uptick, and there's some really interesting research, which I mention in the book, which looks at the effect of the pandemic on dogs, because I think a lot of us have had this sense that the pandemic helped to make more fearful dogs simply because of the circumstances in which so many people were rushing out to get dogs. They maybe were not making the same decisions that they might have made, like in order to avoid puppy farms, for example. But also then there were periods of time in which people either couldn't go to a puppy class and socialize their puppy, or maybe they could, but they didn't feel safe to, and they didn't feel safe to take their puppy out and about. And there is now some evidence that this is actually filtering through into more dogs with some kind of fear or anxiety, unfortunately.
Yeah, and that's what we've seen anecdotally. And it's nice, and even, a little bit aside, children, I've talked to I have friends who are teachers and college teach all levels. And one college professor said it's going to take us about 10 years to recover for our children, that are still coming into college. So it makes sense that if, because we were all housebound and we couldn't go explore things. So some of these younger children who were also in their time of socialization and exploring the world. So it makes sense. And I'm glad they're finally doing the study, because anecdotally, we have all seen it, but it's always nice when the studies, back up what we are seeing, not that we want dogs to be anxious, but, it's just how, it's nice to know that we're not just making this up, that it's all, been studied now. So, and, you wrote about, WAG and purr. What prompted you to decide to go for bark?
I did a lot of work with fearful dogs, and but really I was inspired by my own dog Bodger. So he had quite a few fears and anxieties, some of which I share about in Bark, and he really was the inspiration for it and the reason I wanted to think about writing this. But also I've obviously worked with quite a few fearful dogs and seen the difference that people can make. And I think it's such a difficult situation, because if people make wrong decisions, especially early on, that can really make things happen quite slowly. And it can be incredibly slow with a fearful dog. And you have to go at the dog's pace. And it's important to recognize that. But when you know the right things to do and you're able to implement them early, then that's when it's going to make the biggest difference. So I wanted to make sure that some of this information would get out there. And also, I especially wanted to talk to people about how to do counter conditioning, because it's one of those things that people find it's quite technical. It honestly it is quite technical, but I wanted to try and find ways to explain that so that it's much easier for people to do, because this is such a powerful technique to use with fearful, anxious, and reactive dogs. And I just wanted to try and demystify it and make it easier for people to actually do that with their own dog.
For sure, and you mentioned just a few minutes ago too about body language and you call it bark. So sometimes people don't understand that bark is, a sign of fear. Sometimes people say they're excited, all their different exclamations. And so we have the more fight part that people, if they lunge and bark, people really want help. But you're also able to help those dogs who go the other direction, who go maybe into freeze or, flight and really having this understanding that I love that you're using the positive reinforcement for bark, but all of them need positive reinforcement and counter conditioning. But a lot of times people will, because the dogs bark, they go to if go on the wrong path and they find a trainer who says, here's a shock collar or here's something that can just make the situation so much worse. I mean, because it's doing the opposite of what counter conditioning, what we want to do with positive reinforcement counter conditioning. So I love that you chose bark as well as for a name, because that's usually the thing that people go to, but they need to understand that these dogs also that shut down are also, fearful. So it's a great thing. I meant to bring that up with the body language. It's something I talk to clients all the time of, you really need to understand your body language because that's the only way they can communicate, with you. So that makes it a little bit, more interesting. Like if you just, said shy dog, people might not put it together, as well. So I really like that your titles are so to the point, but also so much more information that's just in that four-letter word, than that if people really learn about it. So something I was thinking about when you said that before. What would you say, because you obviously do a lot of research for your books and you're great about, getting all the studies and the research. What is something that you found the most maybe surprising or the most interesting that you found as you were researching, because you have experience with, working with fearful dogs. You had a fearful dog. So some things may have been aha moments like, oh, that's why, or, some things may have been like, oh yeah, I know that, I know that. But a lot of times when we do research, when we've done something for a long time, a little popcorn, one of my friends calls them popcorn thoughts, where it's like, oh, I hadn't really thought about it that way. Did you have any interesting things that came out when you were writing the book and researching for the book?
Yeah, one of the things I found really interesting actually is because a lot of the research on counter conditioning is either with rats and mice, which I think everybody knows that there's been a lot of research done that way, or it's with people, and there's very little specifically with dogs, but that doesn't matter because we're all mammals and the processes of learning these days, we understand that there's a lot that's very, very common across mammals. But the research with people on classical conditioning, counter conditioning, it very often uses either chocolate or money. Um, and the interesting thing about that, there's a bit of an issue with some of the studies with people because you don't know that participants necessarily trust the psychologist to actually give them the money at the end of the experiment. So that's a potential issue with that. Whereas the chocolate, I think, like if you get, I think people are probably more likely to believe that perhaps. But it's actually quite interesting because there's been a lot of debate about whether counter conditioning is the best approach to take, or if it's simply enough for an animal to have exposure, safe exposure to the thing that they're afraid of. And it does seem from that research that counter conditioning is the best approach to take, is the one that works best. I was really pleased because I've always had a feeling about that. So it's like you said earlier, it's nice when you think something is the case and then you find the science that actually confirms what you think. So that was really nice to know too.
That's a really interesting point that you brought out, that trust that goes along with the counter conditioning. Plus, I also do use treats, and I have some people who say, "Oh, you don't have to use treats, to counter condition." But I experienced the same thing. I felt like I've rarely, unless a dog was like super toy driven or ball driven or something where, but then they're not actually learning. They're just being distracted by the ball. So I don't think that they actually are getting that counter conditioning that I'm attempting to do when I'm working with them. So that is an interesting thing. But I think it's interesting that you said too about, so they use chocolate or money in it with humans. And, the chocolate they seem to accept, but the money, maybe they think it's going to get taken away from them. Or, that's an interesting, did they talk more about why they think that? The reason I'm asking you this is, we use treats a lot for dogs, but sometimes people do want to go and use an alternative reinforcer, the ball, a tug toy. But one of my, it's just crazy. You just brought this up. I had never thought about, I mean, I have, but not in this detail. Because one of the reasons I tell people sometimes, if you use a toy, you have to then take the toy away in order to reproduce, to get repetition. So if you're working on sit and you throw the ball, well, then you have to take the ball away for them to sit again, where a treat gets eaten and nobody can take it away. Did they talk about that in the research of why a human might be worried that the tester was going to take the money away?
I don't know that. I think there's probably just a history of people thinking psychologists doing experiments are kind of playing mind games with you, maybe. So that's probably the issue with that. But it's a really interesting question. And actually, there are people who would prefer not to use treats, and the research shows it's much, much better if there is something like that. It's a really good idea to be using really special treats, because what you want to create when the dog experiences the thing that they consider scary from a safe distance, where they feel safe, because you want to combine this with what we call desensitization. But what you want to do is create something that is a really nice, big, positive surprise. So the technical term for that is an expectancy violation. So the dog knows that this scary thing is all the way over there where they still feel safe, but they have previous negative memories of what that thing causes. And instead, you want to give them a really positive surprise of it being something absolutely wonderful. And so treats is just the easiest way to do that. And you can use food that is not the kind of food that they normally get. Obviously not kibble, but something like steak or roast beef or roast chicken or cheese or whatever the dog happens to really love. So it's very important from like the scientific technical point of view to do that.
I love that you just said that even the science says we need to use steak because, or something. I mean, not, they don't say steak specifically, obviously, but because that is a problem sometimes when you're working with somebody and you're doing counter conditioning and desensitization, that they're worried about calories or they're worried about something else. And you can do like chicken, which is a lower calorie alternative, but then you can also reduce the kibble a little bit if they're doing a lot of practice. But what I always tell people in my world when I use this as an example, I'm like, I love chocolate pie. Lemon meringue is okay. I actually prefer the meringue part over the lemon. So if I was doing something for you and you gave, like, cleaned your house and you gave me a chocolate pie, I'd be like, when can I come over again and clean your house? But if you gave me a lemon meringue, I'd be like, oh, thank you, because I wouldn't want to be rude. So I would take it. And then I'd probably drop it off at my mom's house. But then I probably wouldn't come back and clean your house again because I would be like, well, they give me lemon meringue. And then if you put that with something that's scary, so, I don't always like heights. And if you told me, well, climb up to the top of that ladder to get that lemon meringue pie, I'd probably be like, I'll just go without, but the chocolate pie might be a little bit more motivating. So finding that the dogs like, and I do think that that's important to the treat value isn't just us positive dog trainings trying to push hot dogs on people, and their dogs. We're actually talking from they need to have something spectacular because if you're afraid of spiders or snakes and I give you, $1, you may not care. But if I was like, here's $1,000, you might be more willing to work through that, fear and be more excited about the training rather than, oh gosh, here she goes again. She's going to expose me to dogs and people I don't like. So I love that the science is even, showing that too. And I've briefly got to look at the advanced copy. So, and I've been looking through it and it's super fun, like stories. And I love that because I think people like having stories that they can relate. Do you have any favorite stories from the book? I mean, because you have, different stories, probably maybe some about your dog, but maybe about other dogs.
Yeah, there are several stories that I share in the book, and they're not just about my own dogs. There's also other people were kind enough to share stories about their dogs with me. But I guess because Bodger was my inspiration, then one of my favorite stories is about him and how when I was a student at the Academy for Dog Trainers, I really struggled with one of the specific assignments that we had to do. All the others I'd gone through, including one that a lot of people find hard. Bodger was so clever, it was just a breeze, but he didn't like being handled at all when we first adopted him, and he still didn't like having his muzzle handled. So to train him to be good for a vet exam was really, really hard.
Yeah.
I had to get extra help. I had to get a special plan that was just for Bodger that Jean Donaldson kindly wrote for me. And eventually we got it. But there was a point at which I was like, I am never going to be able to get this dog to let me pill him, which was one of the things that we had to do. And then I didn't do after that any practice with him for years. And then years later, he suddenly became very ill. It turned out he had a very deadly cancer called hemangiosarcoma. He survived the surgery for it and he needed chemo. And then he stopped eating. because usually dogs tolerate chemo very well, but he
Mhm.
couldn't eat because of it. And
Mhm.
so he needed a pill to help him get over the nausea, but he wouldn't eat anything. So we couldn't try any of the tricks of wrapping it in salami or cheese paste or anything like that. And he actually had to be pilled. And if we hadn't done that training all those years earlier, I don't know how we would have got that pill in him. But instead, because we had done that, a bit of butter on the pill to help it go down, and we
Mhm.
were able to pill him, and then he started eating again. And so he only lived for a few months after that, but that because of that, that helped to give us some extra time. So I think it just shows that you never know how valuable the training is that you will do. I just did it for an assignment, and then it turned out to be something that was really so important for him later on in his life.
It's something, one of the things I also do is puppy socialization classes, and I've been doing them, since the 90s. And I joke with my students that I will probably do it until, I can't walk my own, like until I die, because just exactly what you said, part of what, and you talk about this in the book too, about the socialization period and, and exposing dogs, to as many different things. But so socialization is one piece, when you have that prime age that they're young and their brain is still malleable and ready to take all these changes. But before they're 4 months old, so before they've finished all of their vaccines, before people think to take them out. But it's not just socialization, but it's also all these exposure things. And cooperative care is becoming a huge thing in dog training and getting dogs prepared to be able to handle going to the vet and being used to it. And I have actually quite a few clients these days that it starts out usually though because they had a problem at a vet hospital. So we're going backwards and we are doing a lot of prep behind the scenes. I have one client who rescued a dog who had bad experience, but before he even took her, we did cooperative care plans before. I tell people it's like planning for an emergency. It's like planning for, I'm in California, so planning for an earthquake or a fire. It's planning for a tornado or a hurricane. You need to have those plans in place so when the emergency happens, you know what to do, or you've gotten some experience. So, I think that that's another thing that with these reactive, fearful, anxious dogs that, that we see, sometimes we don't, it's because we're responding after the fact rather than preparing. Do you have anything that that you want to share about that, like with preparing, whether it's from socialization period and like the importance of that, or just like you did happen to be an assignment and then it ended up being such a great skill that you were able to do with your baby?
Yeah, and you're so right about the socialization because that sensitive period is so, so important. And it's such a good opportunity to get puppies used to all the things that they're going to need to meet later. And there's actually a piece of research that I mentioned in WAG, not in Bark, but it shows that when people had to evacuate after that massive, massive earthquake in Japan, the ones who were able to take their pets with them tended to have pets where like they'd done some training and the pets were better behaved, and the people whose pets were more difficult, it's quite understandable that it was harder therefore for them to be able to evacuate. So all of the training that you do to help your dog cope with normal life, it comes into play kind of double if you have the misfortune to end up in that kind of situation, because it really helps you in those situations too.
For sure, things like giving pills, cleaning ears, doing eye drops, those can be very scary and invasive to, a dog. They don't understand why you're doing all these things, and preparing it when that doesn't hurt. Because if you're trying to teach them and the ear is already hurting, you really don't want you to touch them, or in, your situation, I'm sick. I can't, you can't hide it in a treat. So, how can we make you comfortably take this pill, and it's interesting that you should say the study from Japan. I would be really interested to see that study in more depth because we had a huge fire called the Thomas Fire, and it started in Ventura, and then it went up the coast of California. At that time, it was the biggest fire that California had had. Unfortunately, we've had some bigger ones since then, and people were evacuating every which way. In the aftermath of that, as a dog trainer, because I've been doing this for a really long time, is that's exactly what happened is dogs who were not trained in a kennel didn't mean that they had to be in a kennel like every day all the time, but maybe they did kennel training as a puppy just for potty training purposes, and maybe not at all, because there were some trainers who were like, oh, don't you don't need to use crate training. all these different varieties of reasons. Those were the dogs that came to me because they were terrified after the fire. So they were afraid of small spaces. They were just scared in general. They definitely couldn't go into a crate. Some of them were afraid of the car. And there were just so many things. Plus, they got evacuated, many of them, to a humane society or to an evacuation place, or a family or friend invited the family to them, but said, your dog has to stay in a crate because we have a dog or we have cats or whatever reason. And it really has changed my philosophy of preparing dogs for kennels and crates. And when I have somebody who says, well, I don't really want a crate in my house, my dog's potty trained, I give that example. I say, they don't have to live in it all the time. It doesn't have to be their thing, but they should be comfortable in it. They should be comfortable going in it. They should be comfortable resting in it, and being able to stay and not have it be a terrible thing, because they might need to go in a crate at the vet, or they might need to do something like that. And now when people kind of fight me, or, just don't really want to do a crate, that's all especially here, because the Thomas fire was only, 6 years ago, and not that long ago. Everybody remembers. We all still have PTSD if we smell smoke. I mean, everybody in the community. So having that preparation is so important. It's just something we just don't, always think about when we're doing dog training. But if we did, we wouldn't have some of these other fears and stress that, for the dogs. So that's a really interesting point that they studied in Japan, even because that was such a big, massive situation.
Yeah, and so difficult. And of course, if something happens, you want to take your pet with you. You don't want your pet to get left behind. And I agree with you about teaching dogs to like a crate, even if you don't want to use a crate in your home. You never know if the dog is going to have to be hospitalized at the vet, or some kind of disaster happens and they have to be. One of the other things from the research is about how important the first time something happens is. So it really helps if the first time that a dog experiences something is positive and they lay down good memories about it. Because unfortunately, if they make negative memories the first time of something, those negative memories never go away. So we might get to kind of overwrite them, but it's like they don't actually get deleted, to use a computer metaphor. So they're kind of still there. So it's really helpful if the first time anything happens, and of course with puppies is the most often times that we do this, but there are lots of other times when dogs do get firsts in their life, and especially some of the dogs that come from some of the more difficult circumstances, like they've come from a cruelty case, or they've previously been a lab dog or something like that, then they are still actually going to get lots of firsts, and that's something that you can use to your advantage to help them learn to like the world, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I talk to my clients about single event learning a lot, and doing that. And that's the whole point of puppy classes, get them exposed to all these things positively. But if we also just look at that in ourselves, if you had a bad experience on a plane the first time and it was turbulence, or you might not want to go on a plane again. I had a really bad experience the first time I kayaked. It was terrible. and I have now learned to kayak, and it's not always terrible. Like I have rationalized, but is like if somebody asks me, gives me 10 opportunities, it's not going to be one of the top things I want to do. Not that actually I have had bad experiences since, but that first experience was really, it was in Africa, and the guys all, if you fall in, get off the shore soon because the hippos or the crocodiles will kill you. And I'm like, and we were going up against the wind, so it was really hard. The whole time I was like, why am I even doing this? I am paying to do this. And I did not kayak for years after that. I was invited and I wouldn't. And then I was forced to, sort of, in an event with my daughter. And I was like, okay, I'll do it for you. And it wasn't as bad. And then I've done it since. But that is because of the way our brain wires it. Our brain is so good at keeping us safe that sometimes it's too good at keeping us safe by having that hardwired memory in it. So that's a really good point, because you get people who have a dog. If we go back to bark, that's fearful, and they're just, and one of my questions always is, has anything scary happened that you know of, that could have led to this, especially if they're a younger dog and maybe it's very specific to a trigger. It's not general anxiety or something like that. Sometimes people just don't, remember at all. And then sometimes it's Oh my gosh, I stepped on their foot in the kitchen when they were 5 months old, and they've never been able to go back in the kitchen again, or what, something like that. So I think that that's an important thing for people to realize is sometimes you can do everything right and something can happen in the world too. I do know that you mentioned a little bit, and recognizing that you are not a veterinary behaviorist, so you're not a veterinarian, but you talk about the importance of medications. And, sometimes that there are some cases, not all. And we don't have to go into detail about the specifics, but from the science and, your studies, and as a vet tech, and I follow a lot of veterinary behaviorists, it's something that's becoming, why people are sometimes resistant to medication, but sometimes these fearful guys, these fearful dogs, need a little medication. What did some of your research, when you talked about that in your chapter about when they might need a little bit more, what is some of the information you've come up with studies around that?
Yeah, and I also did some interviews with vet behaviorists and a resident in vet behavior. So I was very lucky to speak to people about this because as you say, I'm not a veterinarian, so I can't recommend medication, but I do know a bit about when you should see your vet. And I think anytime you're actually struggling, it's a good idea to see your veterinarian and see what they recommend and if they would recommend something, because they have options that they can offer for both short-term or longer-term acting medications. And I think sometimes people feel quite reluctant about that. And so I just wanted to share some information to help people understand why these are recommended, that veterinarians have their reasons for this. And for example, in some situations where you can't prevent the dog from experiencing the thing that they're afraid of. One of the examples I was given was to do with just dialing down the anxiety enough that the dog is actually able to learn. Because if they're too stressed, it's too hard. Your counter conditioning isn't really going to work very well. It's too much for them to be paying attention to. So I think it's something that if anyone's worried, they should just go and have a conversation with their vet about it, or their vet behaviorist if their vet thinks they need a referral onto them.
For sure, for sure. I have had some veterinary behaviorists on the podcast here, and it's something that we talk about. And now I just went to a conference and they were talking about, these puppies that maybe have genetic fear, or they came, fearful. Why wait until they're a year and a half of, fear, starting a lot younger? So the veterinary behaviorists are starting to really even treat those because of that learning. Your brain can't learn if it's so worried about the environment or the noise or just that general kind of anxiety. So of all these things, I mean, it's so many things. Why are they afraid, and training them. And I mean, like, I know this is going to be my, especially when I get my print version, so that I'm not carrying around my 300 pages of notes, so I can carry it easy. I think it's going to be one that I really want people to understand, because you really go through like the why, and some of the preventions, like with socialization. But if you had to, in a nutshell, kind of explain or tell somebody why this is so important and why we really need more information. There are some books out there, but there's really not a ton that are super accurate or up to date. You're probably going to be, when it comes out in October, being the most up to date because it's the newest published and with all the new science. What is something you really would want people to know when they're dealing with their anxious or fearful reactive dog?
One of the main things is really how important it is to help your dog to feel safe. And one of the best ways that you can do that is to put distance between your dog and whatever they're afraid of, or just to help make sure that they never have to meet it, or come across it. And with some fearful dogs, that's going to be all that you have to do. Like if they're afraid of horses, but you never see horses except once a year, then that's probably all you need to do. You don't need to do anything about it. But then one of the other tips I give right at the beginning is that if something scary does happen and you haven't been able to prevent it, you can do something that we call ad hoc counter conditioning. So basically, something scary happens, you give them a really, really special treat. And even if they're too scared to take it in that moment, you should still offer it to them. And of course, you want to increase the distance, get them away from whatever they're afraid of as well. But that's really important, because you absolutely never want to put your dog in a situation where they have to face the thing that they're afraid of, because that will make things much, much worse. And so keep them away, keep them safe. And then if you have no choice, like you've got a reactive dog and someone else's off leash dog comes running up, get yourself out of there, but also give them a really tasty snack to kind of try and make it a bit better, and just do it what we call ad hoc counter conditioning.
I love that too, because, so many times when I give that advice, people say, well, aren't you reinforcing them to be fearful? That's usually the comeback when somebody's resistant, and they're not responding in in an operant way at all. Like they're not, thinking about it in I'm learning to be afraid. I mean, how many of us, get a piece of chocolate when we're scared and stressed and get more scared? I mean, sometimes we say, I'm having a hard day, I need some chocolate. That doesn't make us want more hard days or more fear. So I do love that you include that, because a lot of times that's the, pushback you might get from somebody saying, but if I comfort them, because I do, you talk about it's okay to comfort them. It's okay, to help them soothe when they're in that fearful moment, just like we would with a friend or a spouse or a child or, something else. If somebody's scared, we hug them or we bring them close, and we also get them out of the, environment. We don't make them, force them to get over their fear. We comfort them until they calm down a little, and they may or may not overcome that fear. Well, I could keep you here all day long and we could talk about this. But what I wanted to ask, one last thing as we kind of wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to share with the audience?
Well, I actually have some really exciting events coming up in the run up to the publication of Bark. So, Bark is published on the 1st of October, and all through September, I'm going to be running a book festival for animal lovers, which is called Bark Fest. And we have some of my favorite authors coming to take part and to talk about their books. So, that includes people like Patricia McConnell, Mark Beckhoff, and Jean Donaldson. And it also includes newer authors such as Kerry Nichols and Alexis Devine coming to talk about their books, which are quite recent books. We have a couple of sessions on cat books, and we even have a session with crime and mystery writers talking about their books, which have dogs playing an important role in the books. So it's going to be a really fun thing. And if anybody wants to learn about it, you can come along. They're all free sessions, and it's going to be the details on companionanimalpsychology.com.
That is going to be, fantastic. And can they pre-order Bark?
Yes, Bark is available for pre-order now from your favorite bookstore and from Amazon, and it will also be available in Kindle and audio versions, but at the moment it's just the Kindle and the print that you can pre-order.
I'm very excited that I got to talk to you before the launch. And anyone who's listening, if you have not read any of Zazie's books, you should get all three of them, because they're great. They're up to date. They're well written. They're fun, good stories, easy to read too. So they're not, we keep talking about studies and science, and sometimes that scares people. But Zazie does a great job of breaking it down in easy to understand ways, so that you don't have to feel intimidated. And like with Bark, but with the others too, you don't have to read it from front cover to back if that doesn't work for your style, because maybe you're busy and you're just like, I have this puppy, I want to read about puppies, or I have this dog with separation anxiety, which we didn't even get a chance to talk about because, like I said, we could talk all day long. But oh, I have one that's, has separation anxiety, or some different things. You can go through the table of contents, and it's very clear and easy. And you can just flip to that chapter that you need. As I've been flipping through it, I just, get caught on things like a story will catch my eye, or a little phrase. And then next thing I know, I'm a couple pages in and I'm reading it. But it's very simple. So all of her books, Wag, Purr, and now Bark, it's just a great, easy to read. And all this information is so important for our animals. So for their future and their humane treatment as we progress into this, more future positive reinforcement and, training. So thank you so much for being here. I love talking to you as always. And if there's anything else you want to add, you're welcome to. Otherwise, we'll let you get back to more writing and publishing and all the things that you do so well.
Well, thank you so much. It's always so much fun to chat with you.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Zazie, and good luck. And I know that I'm going to see you in more things, and we'll be ready to podcast when you write your next book.
Oh, well, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for listening. This is Zazie Todd. We'll have all of her that book information for Bark, but you can check out all of her other things on Amazon or your bookstores. They will all, whichever bookstore is your favorite bookstore, you can check them out there. So thank you.